The wind picked up quick that morning at Portland International, strong enough to ground my flight and upend the weekend plans I had neatly arranged. I wasn't supposed to be back home until Sunday, but there I was, standing on my porch that Friday afternoon, suitcase still dangling from my hand, deciding to turn the sudden change into a surprise. Brendan and Kayla had offered to stay at the house while their kitchen was being redone. They said they could use the quiet. I pictured them curled up on my couch, maybe watching a movie, maybe laughing. But as I reached for the spare key and stepped closer to the door, I caught voices drifting through the cracked kitchen window. I hadn't meant to listen, but the words that carried out made my chest clench and my breath catch. My son's wife, calm and almost gentle, said, "I've already started putting the drops in her drinks." The sky hung heavy when I landed back in Oregon, the air thick with that sticky kind of summer rain. My trip home wasn't planned. The airline had canceled my connection, and I didn't feel like wasting the night in some airport hotel. So I grabbed the earliest flight back and headed straight for my house. I was even a little eager. It had been years since I'd surprised anyone. I imagined Brendan and Kayla settled in, maybe cooking dinner together, maybe content. The cab rolled into the driveway, and I smiled at the thought. I didn't announce myself. I wanted to knock and watch their faces light up. But the closer I walked toward the front door, the more a tug deep in my chest told me to slow down. The window above the sink was cracked just enough for the curtain to flutter, and just enough for voices to slip through. Kayla's voice carried clearly. Not angry, not sharp. She sounded practical, as though she were discussing a new recipe or errands to run. "I've already started putting the drops in her drinks," she said. "That should start showing in a week or so." Brendan stayed silent for a moment, then finally muttered, "Do we really need all that?" "She's already forgetful," Kayla answered smoothly. "It has to be recorded, or we won't be able to secure guardianship." My hand tightened around the key in my coat pocket. I felt frozen, ice creeping through my fingertips. Drops in my drinks, guardianship. I stood on that porch, drizzle dampening my shoulders, staring at the same door I had walked through 1,000 times before. But in that moment, it didn't feel like my home anymore. If you've ever returned somewhere expecting comfort only to find it turned into something unrecognizable, then you know the hollow shock that pressed against my ribs. I forced myself to swallow, drew in a steady breath, and straightened. Then I opened the door with a smile, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. And so the performance began. The second I stepped inside, Kayla spun around from the kitchen island with a startled smile. Brendan stood stiff near the fridge, one hand resting on a half-shut cabinet. They hadn't expected me. That much was obvious. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door like I always did, rolled my suitcase across the floor, glanced around casually, and said in the most even tone I could manage, "Flight got cancelled. Surprise." Kayla rushed over with open arms. Brendan muttered something about the weather. I leaned into Kayla's hug, and for the first time, I realized how strange it felt to hold someone who had just been planning to undo my life. Her perfume smelled of citrus and powder, clean and controlled. Dinner was already underway, chicken roasting in the oven, something bubbling on the stove. She offered me a glass of warm milks, saying it might help after the travel stress. I accepted it. The glass felt smooth, just a little too warm in my hand. I brought it to my lips, let a small sip slide over my tongue. It had a faint floral taste, not bad, just wrong. I smiled carefully, the way I always had since Brendan turned 16 and began looking at me with that hard, distant gaze. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's just what I needed." We sat down together, the three of us. Kayla kept the small talk going, asking polite questions. Brendan barely spoke. I answered slowly, letting my words stretch longer than normal. I dropped in the neighbor's name when I meant to talk about the cats. I paused mid-sentence more than once, feigning a lost thought. Their eyes flickered toward each other quick, subtle. Later that night, I unpacked my suitcase, folded my clothes neatly, and pretended nothing had shifted. Then I sat in the living room, letting the house sink into quiet. Kayla appeared with a tray of cookies and tea. She smiled and said, "I'm glad you're home early. You should rest. Let us help around the house while you settle in." I nodded. "That's very kind of you." When she left, I placed the untouched cup on the mantel and leaned back. This wasn't the house I had left, and I was no longer the woman they remembered. I stared out the window for a long time, not with fear, but with focus. Every performance has an opening scene. I had just stepped onto the stage. By morning, the rhythm of the house felt different, no longer mine. Brendan left early, muttering something about the bank. Kayla stayed behind, hovering close with a warmth that felt more like surveillance than care. I shuffled through the kitchen, dragging my steps, letting my words slur slightly at the edges. I fumbled with the kettle. She offered to help. I declined, smiling faintly. When she stepped outside to take a call, I moved quickly to the cabinet near the pantry. Tucked beneath the felt lining of the top drawer was a small recorder, dusty, but still working. I slipped it into my pocket and returned to the table. When Kayla came back in, I asked if I'd already taken my blood pressure pills. She smiled. "Yes, about half an hour ago." I nodded like I wasn't quite sure, my eyes drifting toward the window as if I'd lost track of the day. That afternoon, I made sure to leave my phone face up on the hallway table. I set a fake calendar alert to buzz in 20 minutes. I knew Kayla had a habit of checking things. She liked control, quiet but firm, right on time. The notification popped up. "Neurology consult, Dr. Edelson." While I watered plants on the porch, she picked up the phone and put it back exactly where I had left it. But the alert was gone. I smiled to myself. At dinner, I told Brendan the cat had been hiding all day, though we hadn't had a cat for over a year. He blinked, hesitated, then quickly changed the subject. Kayla's eyes lingered on me, narrowing just slightly. I asked her to pass the salt, then called her Julia. I corrected myself a bit too late. She didn't respond. That night, I slipped the recorder under the cushion of my armchair and left it running while I pretended to drift off in front of the TV. They thought I was asleep. I wasn't. Brendan whispered, "She's slipping." "Did you hear her today?" Kayla replied, "It's happening faster than I expected. The doctor will back us up once we get the paperwork ready." Her words settled in me like sediment, heavy and predictable. Later, I tucked the recorder into a manila folder, labeled it with a sticky note that read Day 1, sealed it shut, and hid it behind the books in my old office closet. The next morning, I brewed coffee without a filter. I called the garage the garden. I left the refrigerator door open for 20 minutes. Kayla gently suggested she take over the groceries from now on. I nodded, smiling faintly. They were building their case. I was building mine. The act was no longer just a mask. It had become a second skin. By the end of the week, I had found a rhythm. I woke early, shuffled around the kitchen just enough to look absent-minded, then wandered out to the garden and chatted with the roses like they were old friends. Brendan and Kayla seemed reassured. They assumed I was fading quickly. I let them. One morning, I heard Kayla in the sunroom, speaking softly on the phone. I caught only fragments, something about a document waiting for a physician's signature, something about capacity and pre-approval. I stood just out of sight, closed my eyes, and forced myself to stay calm. Then I turned away, humming as I filled a pot of water I had no intention of using. That afternoon, while Kayla was out and Brendan had dozed off in the recliner, I sat at the desk in my old sewing room. From the closet, I pulled out a shoebox and lined it with envelopes. On sticky notes, I scribbled short sentences, some real, like appointments and grocery lists. Others, overheard bits of their plans, names, phrases, dates. Each note went into its own envelope, labeled and sealed by day. At the bottom, I placed a USB drive holding the recordings, taped beside the little recorder that had been quietly running every evening. The archive was growing. That night at dinner, I let the silence hang longer than usual. Kayla finally asked if I was feeling all right. I smiled softly. Sometimes I feel like the days all blur together now. She seemed satisfied with that ... Then she leaned in gently, her voice sugar-coated, her eyes sharp, and said we should talk soon about simplifying my affairs, so things wouldn't get complicated later. I nodded, pretending not to catch the weight of her words. I waited until midnight. When the house had gone still, I slipped into the kitchen. Brendan always left his laptop charging by the dining room outlet. I didn't touch it, but I noted the login screen. Behind it, an insurance tab was open with a document labeled guardianship draft. The next morning, I fumbled with the toaster, dropped the butter, forgot the coffee pot was already full. Kayla handed me a smoothie she'd made. I looked her straight in the eye, thanked her, and sipped without hesitation. Beneath the flower vase between us, the recorder was hidden. I needed her voice on record, not just her intentions, but the way she said things, the careful tilt of control in every word. By evening, I sat in my reading chair, the shoebox of notes tucked beside me, shadows stretching long across the rug. My hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of betrayal and the energy of planning. I slid the box beneath the cushion, feigned fatigue, but my mind stayed sharp. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I found Brendan on the back porch, nursing a cup of cold coffee. He didn't look up when I opened the sliding door, only gave a slight nod, like he had been expecting me. Wrapped in my cardigan, I took the chair across from him. The air was crisp, the maple leaves rustling. I let the silence stretch before speaking. "Your father used to sit out here every morning," I said softly. "He liked watching the birds more than the news." Brendan's jaw tightened. He sipped and stared ahead. "He always thought you'd take over the garden," I added. "Said you had the hands for it. Quiet strength, he called it." Brendan let out a sharp breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. He always had something to say about what I wasn't, he muttered. Never about what I was. I let him sit with that. Then asked gently, "What do you think he missed for the first time?" Brendan turned to me. His eyes looked worn, the kind of tired that runs deeper than sleep. He ran a hand through his hair and leaned back. "He didn't get me," he said. "Not really. He always thought you were the smart one, the organized one. I was the one who forgot appointments, lost things. When I dropped out of business school, He didn't even yell. He just looked disappointed. That was worse. I felt the ache in his words. I knew that kind of wound, a kind that lingers, unnamed. I never told him, I said quietly, but he worried about you more than anyone. He just didn't know how to show it. He thought if he pushed you, maybe you'd prove him wrong. Maybe you'd become what he couldn't. Brendan's shoulders slumped. When he died, you handled everything, the house, the funeral, the money. No one asked me to do a thing. I felt like a guest at my own father's service. The grief in his voice wasn't fresh, but it was still raw in corners he hadn't touched in years. You were never a guest, I told him. You were grieving in your own way, even if none of us understood. He didn't answer, but I saw something loosen in him, an unraveling. I reached across and rested my hand on his. It's not too late to be different, I whispered. You're not bound to how he saw you. Brendan nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the trees. For a second, he looked like a lost boy again. But even as I offered him comfort, I knew softness could be dangerous. His pain explained his choices, but it didn't excuse them. He had chosen Kayla. He had chosen this plan. I kissed his temple before walking back inside. Behind my bedroom door, I wrote down every word he had spoken, his fears, his shame, his motive, because understanding him didn't mean trusting him. Compassion wasn't permission. At just after 7 a.m., I called Sharon. We hadn't spoken in years, but her number still lived in my worn address book. She picked up on the second ring. Sharon knew how to read between the lines. She'd worked in elder advocacy for decades. If anyone would understand me without needing every detail spelled out, it was her. By the end of the call, we agreed to meet at a quiet diner outside town. I arrived early, choosing a booth in the back. When Sharon walked in, dressed in a navy suit with her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, she looked just as she had when we were both in our 50s, composed, alert, impossible to fool. After ordering coffee, she leaned forward. Tell me everything. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of Brendan's emails to a financial advisor I had never authorized. The most recent one, just 2 days old, mentioned guardianship options and strategic control of assets. Next, I handed her a flash drive with the audio clips I'd collected. Kayla's voice was crisp and clear, matter of fact, talking about paperwork and a memory test scheduled with Dr. Patel. Each replay chilled me in a new way. Finally, I produced a small container. I had poured out the last of the so-called smoothie base from the carton Kayla kept in the fridge, sealed it in a lab vial I'd picked up at the pharmacy. I didn't know what was inside, but Sharon promised she would have it tested quietly. She flipped through everything, her brow furrowed, her jaw tightening. When she looked up, her expression was grave. Marian, you can't stay there much longer without formal legal protection, she said firmly. If they're moving toward guardianship, even small mistakes could be used against you. You're ahead now, but if they feel cornered, they won't hesitate. I nodded, my stomach tight but steady. I wasn't ready to leave yet. There was more to uncover, more to confirm. I told her I had backup copies of every file hidden where Brendan and Kayla would never find them. I also mentioned that I had removed my medical proxy papers from the kitchen drawer and placed them in my bank's safe deposit box. Sharon's hand rested on mine, firm and warm. You're doing the right thing, she said, but you need to choose your next move before they make theirs. We parted with a quiet hug. She took the evidence with her. I walked back to my car, the autumn whined sharp on my cheeks. Later that evening, I sat on the edge of my bed and reread a note I had written months earlier. It was a simple list: bank contact, attorney's name, asset file location, and one final line: if anything happens to me suddenly, none of this was an accident. I tucked the note into an envelope and taped it under the drawer of my nightstand, just in case. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen blinds in soft stripes. Brendan had already left for a meeting with the estate planner. Kayla was still in the shower. It was the perfect chance. I unlocked the drawer beneath the bookshelf in my study. Inside was a small black pouch containing the original trust documents my husband and I had signed 2 years before he died. Beside them lay a revised version, notarized 6 months ago, naming a different financial manager and cutting Brendan out entirely. That revision had been witnessed quietly by a traveling notary Sharon had recommended before Henry's final decline. There was also the legitimate power of attorney filed months earlier with our credit union naming our longtime advisor, Cheryl Kim. She had worked with Henry for over 20 years and knew my intentions well. I laid out the documents on the desk, tracing Henry's steady signature with my fingertips. Even in his last months, his trust in me was clear on every page. I sealed the papers in a folder, slipped it into my tote, and draped a scarf over the top. That afternoon, I planned to meet Cheryl to reconfirm the freeze we had placed on all withdrawals above a certain amount. At the time, I thought it was just caution. Now I knew it was foresight. When I walked into Cheryl's office, she greeted me with a quiet nod. We reviewed the documents together. Everything was still intact. Brendan's name was nowhere in the decision-making authority, just as I intended. Before I left, I gave Cheryl a USB drive with select audio clips and photos, not all of it, just enough to establish a pattern if anything happened. She agreed to store it off-site with Sharon's notarized affidavit documenting the timeline. When I returned home, the house felt different again. Brendan's car was in the driveway. Kayla hummed in the kitchen, garlic and rosemary in the air, her way of softening ground before making a move. At dinner, Brendan casually brought up consolidating household accounts. I smiled gently, excused myself, and washed the dishes. The cracks were showing now, thin but spreading. They had no idea I'd already shifted the foundation beneath them. By Thursday morning, I knew the act had to reach its peak. If they were going to believe I was declining, I had to give them urgency, the kind that justifies bold moves. So I slipped my thick cardigan on backwards, left my hair tangled, and wandered into the living room with a spatula in one hand and my purse in the other. Kayla looked up from her laptop. Her eyes flickered as she tilted her head and asked, in that syrupy voice she reserved for patients, not family, "Need help with something?" I blinked at her, glanced at the spatula, and said I was trying to find my toothbrush. Then I drifted out, without another word. In the backyard, I watered a fake orchid Henry had once brought home from a discount shop in Sedona. I spoke to it as though it were alive. Then I stood at the fence for 10 minutes, staring blankly like I'd forgotten why I was there. That evening, I left soup simmering on the stove until it burned. The smell filled the house. Brendan stormed down with a sharp edge to his voice, demanding what had happened. I stood near the sink, humming an off-key tune from high school days, murmuring that I thought the dog was barking. We hadn't owned a dog in 20 years. His frustration was rising. I saw it in the way he paced, in how he kept tugging open and slamming shut the drawer where the paperwork sat. When Kayla found me tracing Brendan's baby picture on the wall and whispering the wrong name, she quietly texted him right there in the hallway. She didn't realize I noticed. They were ready. That weekend, they handed me another smoothie, the same kind they'd been pressing on me all month. I smiled, took a sip, then poured it into the houseplant the moment they stepped out, rinsing the glass clean. The recorder, in my cardigan pocket, clicked on as Brendan returned later that afternoon. He spoke to Kayla about timing, about whether the doctor had responded. She said she'd follow up, adding, "She thinks I'm doing her a favor with those drinks." I filed that one carefully. That evening, I sat in front of the TV, pretending to scroll through channels I had watched the night before. I laughed at commercials like they were comedy skits. Then I got up and opened the whole closet, announcing I needed to find my high school yearbook to pack for a dentist appointment. Brendan frowned and told me I should rest. I said I was afraid I'd forget my own name if I didn't hold on to old memories. He sat slowly, eyes fixed on me. "Maybe we should get someone to help you, Mom. Just until things settle." I nodded, told him I trusted him. Later, sitting on the edge of my bed, I knew he was outside listening. So I muttered names under my breath, nurses who had cared for Henry. Then I called Kayla by one of those names. I heard Brendan shift in the hallway. They believed it now. They were certain they were right. But what they didn't realize was that they were performing too. And I was the one directing the play. Every word they spoke was captured. Every smile I gave was practiced. Every slip they witnessed was staged. And I wasn't finished. The curtain hadn't fallen, not even close. It was a Tuesday morning when Brendan placed a manila folder on the kitchen table. He said little, just that it was time we got things in order. I stirred oatmeal absent-mindedly, letting the spoon scrape against the pot in a slow rhythm. The silence pressed heavy. He tapped the folder, then slid it toward me. I glanced down, didn't open it. He poured himself coffee and stood behind me, not waiting for conversation, but for compliance. I carried the folder upstairs, hands trembling just enough for him to notice. That was important. Once I shut my bedroom door, I sat on the bed and pulled on my glasses. I opened the folder slowly, as though it were too heavy. Inside were neatly clipped documents. The first was a durable power of attorney. The next, a request for financial guardianship. Both had sections highlighted, spaces waiting for my signature. They were dated only a few days earlier. Kayla's name was written in as witness on two of them. A sticky note in Brendan's handwriting read, "Get Mom's signature by this week. Lawyer needs it for final filing." I felt no hesitation. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos of every page, then sealed the documents in a brown envelope I had tucked away weeks before. I slid it beneath the lining of my old jewelry box, the one Brendan always assumed was empty since I stopped wearing rings after Henry passed. That afternoon, I called Sharon from the pharmacy parking lot. I told her I had something urgent. We met in her office after hours. I handed her the envelope and showed her Brendan's folder. She read each page silently, her jaw tightening with every flip. Then she looked at me with the same calm strength I remembered from our college days, before life weathered us both. "Marian," she said carefully, "if you had signed these, Brendan would have had control over everything, your assets, your medical decisions, even the house. You would have been legally dependent." No hearing, no appeal. The room felt colder. Every ounce of love I had poured into raising that boy curdled into something nameless. I passed her the backup drive with the recordings. She nodded firmly. "I'll contact Elder Protective Services in the morning," she said. Then she pulled a slim folder labeled Emergency Contingency. She had already filled it out in my name. She was ready too. That evening, I returned home with a grocery bag and a quiet face. Kayla asked if I was all right. I nodded. Brendan looked across the table, asked if I had reviewed the papers. I told him I was still thinking, asked to hold onto them a little longer. "Sure," he said smoothly to smoothly. That night, I tucked the originals under my mattress and locked my bedroom door. I lay awake for hours not because I was afraid, but because the worst part wasn't betrayal. It was how calmly they had planned to erase me, one signature at a time. But I wasn't going anywhere. I hadn't survived this long to vanish quietly. Tomorrow, they would learn what it meant to cross a woman who hadn't forgotten who she was. At dawn, I packed the folder and a flash drive into my worn leather tote and drove to Sharon's office. She was waiting, a thermos of black coffee in hand, her eyes sharp and steady. The room felt warmer than usual, like I wasn't alone anymore in this fight. The moment I handed her the evidence, she logged into the state's elder protection portal. She uploaded the audio, the transcripts, the photos, every piece under suspected financial coercion and undue influence. She printed a confirmation receipt, handed me a copy, and sealed the rest in an envelope for the oversight board. Her fingers tapped the envelope like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Then she looked at me and said, "We need to make one more move." I called Mr. Kavanaugh, my financial advisor of more than a decade. He cleared his schedule the same morning. His office sat above a little bakery that always smelled of cinnamon. We met in the quiet, no small talk, just business. I told him it was time to activate the secondary account and finalize the beneficiary shift we had discussed months earlier. No more waiting. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded, pulled up the secure forms, and guided me through every step. By noon, everything was signed and notarized. My estate was placed into a revocable trust managed solely by Kavanaugh and an outside trustee completely outside Brendan and Kayla's reach. Accounts were moved, property rights updated, healthcare proxies revised, every safeguard locked in. Meanwhile, Sharon drafted a cease and desist letter. It would be delivered to Brendan and Kayla by courier. Inside was a simple statement. The household was now monitored by state oversight, and any further pursuit of guardianship would be treated as legal harassment. Before I left Sharon's office, she handed me a sealed white envelope. Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than usual. "This," she said softly, "is our final layer." That evening, I placed the envelope on the mantel where it was impossible to miss. Plain, unremarkable. But inside was a notarized affidavit detailing every suspicious event over the past 3 months, complete with timestamps, recordings, and witnesses. It wasn't just paper. It was a line in the sand, a warning without words. I kept up the act for 2 more days. I shuffled through the kitchen, let Kayla guide me to the table like a nurse. I even let Brendan remind me of my own bank PINs, pretending to forget. But I was watching, listening, waiting. On the 3rd night, I caught Kayla whispering in the laundry room, her voice sharp and low. She spoke of expedited processing, told someone on the other end that Brendan needed me cooperative within the week. She lowered her voice further. "We've already sent the documents," she said. "The rest depends on how confused she seems." My breath caught, but I didn't cry. I walked back to my room, closed the door softly, and opened my laptop. In my draft folder sat a press release prepared by Sharon's daughter, a journalist. If I pressed send, it would go live within 48 hours. Names, patterns. National statistics on guardianship fraud, with my story woven into the thread. I didn't send it. Not yet. Tomorrow. I would see what happened when the envelope on the mantel was opened. The next morning, I tended to the garden as if nothing had changed. But inside, the air was different, too watchful, too quiet. By evening, I noticed the envelope was gone. Someone had opened it. Someone had read it. That night, while folding towels in the laundry room, I heard voices rise in the living room. Kayla's voice first, sharper than I had ever heard it. She stormed in holding the torn envelope, her hand trembling with anger, not fear. Brendan followed, pale and unreadable. "You think you're clever," Kayla snapped. "You think this is going to scare us off." I said nothing. She turned to Brendan, waiting for him to back her up, but he stayed quiet, shoulders hunched, hands buried in his pockets like a scolded boy. Kayla shook the papers in her hand, her voice tight as wire. "All of this, the recordings, the witnesses, the trustee paperwork, it doesn't matter. You can't undo what we've started." I stayed silent. Then Brendan looked at me, really looked as if seeing me for the first time. Not as the mother who raised him, but as someone beyond his control. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, he said it. "You were never going to give it to us. Not the house, not the money. You always planned to cut us out." I stepped closer, steady and calm. "No," I told him. "I never planned to cut you out. I just stopped pretending you were the kind of people I could trust with what mattered most." Kayla scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You want to die a martyr, fine." But Brendan's face shifted. His expression softened, his eyes darting between her and me, like he was searching for a version of himself that still fit in the room. I lifted a framed photo from the mantel, brushing my thumb across the glass. "I never forgot you," I said quietly, "but somewhere along the way, I think I forgot myself." Kayla stormed out. Brendan stayed behind, saying nothing, the air too heavy for words. That night, the house went still. The kind of stillness that lingers, the kind that never fills again. A week later, Brendan and Kale were gone. No note, no apology, just empty closets and a front door that didn't shut right anymore. The photos remained on the walls, but the frames felt less like memories and more like evidence. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat on the porch, the sun casting golden light through the oaks. The breeze carried rosemary from the garden. For the first time in months, I exhaled fully. I wasn't waiting anymore. A silver SUV pulled into the driveway. 3 young women stepped out, clipboards in hand, jackets marked with the crest of the University Medical Center. They came on behalf of a new outreach program, the first initiative of the Ellsworth Fund for Elder Justice. Henry's name now tied to something meaningful. The young woman with dark curls handed me a folder, thanking me for helping fund their training sessions, for making space for stories like mine. She didn't know the whole story, but she knew enough. I walked them through the garden, pointing out the broken irrigation line, the flickering porch light. We laughed. They asked for stories, and I gave them a few, just enough. Later, as the sun dipped low, I sat back in my rocking chair. The quiet that settled over me wasn't loneliness. It wasn't regret. It was space. Brendan would not inherit the estate. That decision had been made months before he even realized. Everything the house, the savings, the investments had already been transferred into the fund. Quietly, legally, intentionally. He thought he was playing a game of strategy, but I had stopped playing long ago. Now my story had a new home. Not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the hands of the next generation. In whispered warnings, in stronger women with clear eyes. If you've ever felt pushed aside, betrayed by the ones closest to you, I hope my quiet strength speaks to you. Justice doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, a boundary drawn, a legacy redefined.